When does a word become a weapon? When does a debate turn into a battlefield? Picture this: a live television studio, the air thick with unspoken grudges, where Senator JD Vance, with his polished suit and sharper tongue, hurls an insult at Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, expecting her to crumble. He calls her trash, a sneer curling his lips, thinking he's won before the fight begins. But Jasmine, forged in the crucible of struggle, doesn't flinch. Her eyes lock onto the camera, steady as stone, and what she says next doesn't just silence the room, it carves her name into the nation's memory. This is no mere spat, it's a collision of worlds: privilege versus perseverance, arrogance against authenticity, and the whole country is watching. The argument erupted on a national broadcast, a panel meant to tackle the rising cost of health care for working families. 4 people sat at a curved wooden table, papers scattered like leaves after a storm. The host, a wiry man with a nervous smile, tried to steer the talk, but the undercurrent was already pulling them off course. Jasmine Crockett, her blazer a deep navy, sat with her hands folded, her face calm but her mind racing. She'd been here before, in rooms where her voice was tested, where her presence was questioned. Across from her, JD Vance leaned back, his chair creaking, his fingers drumming a restless beat. He'd come prepared, not with facts but with venom, ready to turn the discussion into his stage. The topic was personal for Jasmine. Healthcare wasn't just policy. It was her mother's, late nights at the diner, her brother's unpaid medical bills, the neighbors in North Houston who chose between medicine and rent. She spoke first, her voice clear, slicing through the room's hum. She talked about community clinics, about families crushed by debt, about a system that left the poorest to fend for themselves. Her words were measured, but they carried weight, each one landing like a stone in still water. The audience at home leaned closer to their screens, sensing something real. Then Vance struck. He didn't wait for her to finish. His voice, loud and grating, cut through hers like a saw. He scoffed, rolling his eyes, and said the clinics she championed were just freebies for people too lazy to work. The room stilled. The other panelists, a doctor and a policy analyst, shifted uncomfortably. Jasmine's jaw tightened, but she kept her gaze steady, letting him dig his hole. He went on, his tone dripping with disdain, calling her ideas reckless, her passion naive. Then, as if tossing a match into dry grass, he leaned forward and spat the word trash. Not her policies, not her argument, her. The word hung in the air, sharp and ugly. The host coughed, fumbling for control, but it was too late. The audience gasped, a collective intake of breath that echoed through living rooms across the country. Jasmine's hands unclenched, her fingers splaying flat on the table, but her face stayed composed, a mask of steel. She'd heard worse, in courtrooms, in campaign halls, in the whispers of colleagues who thought she didn't belong. But this, on live television, in front of millions, was different. It wasn't just an insult. It was a challenge, a dare to shrink or to rise. She chose to rise. Jasmine leaned into her microphone, her voice low but piercing, and said, "You call me trash because I fight for people you've never met, people you'd never sit with." The camera zoomed in, catching the fire in her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands that betrayed the storm inside. Vance smirked, thinking he'd rattled her, but he didn't see it coming. Her next words were a blade, precise and unyielding, and they were about to change everything. Jasmine Crockett's voice cut through the studio like a winter wind, sharp and undeniable. "You call me trash," she said, "but I'm the one standing for folks who've been thrown away by systems you defend." The words landed hard, each syllable a challenge, and for a split second JD Vance's smirk faltered. His eyes darted to the host, expecting a rescue, but none came. The audience at home held their breath, their coffee cups forgotten, their eyes glued to the screen. This wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a reckoning, and Jasmine was rewriting the rules. Vance recovered quickly, his face hardening. He leaned forward, his voice booming, trying to drown her out. "You're twisting my words," he snapped, jabbing a finger across the table. "This is why nothing gets done. People like you stirring up trouble instead of solving it." His tone was venomous, each word laced with contempt, as if Jasmine's very presence offended him. He didn't just disagree. He wanted to erase her, to make her feel small, to remind her she was an outsider in his world. The other panelists shrank back, their notes untouched, their silence louder than words. But Jasmine didn't budge. She sat taller, her shoulders squared, her gaze locked on Vance. She'd faced men like him before, in North Houston courtrooms, where judges dismissed her clients with a glance, or in campaign offices, where advisors told her to soften her edges. She'd learned early that power didn't come from shouting, but from standing firm. "You're not talking about trouble," she said, her voice steady but fierce. "You're talking about people, families who can't afford a doctor, mothers who pray their kids don't get sick. You call that trouble? I call it reality." The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as if the weight of her words had pressed against the walls. Vance scoffed, rolling his eyes, but his hands betrayed him, fidgeting with his pen, a crack in his armor. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but Jasmine kept going, her words flowing like a river breaking through a dam. "I grew up watching my mother count pennies for asthma inhalers," she said. "I saw neighbors sell furniture to pay for stitches. That's not a handout, that's a failure, your failure to see them as human." The audience erupted in applause, a sudden roar that shook the studio, but Jasmine didn't smile. Her eyes stayed on Vance, daring him to respond. He took the bait, his voice rising to a near shout. "You're playing the victim," he snarled, his face flushed. "Always the same story, blaming everyone else. It's not my job to fix your community's messes." The word "you're" stung, a deliberate jab, as if Jasmine alone carried the weight of every struggling neighborhood. The host tried to cut in, his voice thin and shaky, but Vance waved him off, his aggression spilling over. "You're out of your depth," he said, pointing at her. "Stick to speeches, not policy." Jasmine's hands stilled, her fingers no longer tracing the table's edge. She took a slow breath, the kind that steadies a storm, and leaned closer to her microphone. "You think I'm out of my depth?" she asked, her voice low, each word a spark ready to ignite. "I've been swimming in deeper waters than you'll ever know, waters you drown in." The audience gasped, sensing the shift, the moment where Jasmine wasn't just defending herself, but claiming the room. Vance's face twitched, his confidence cracking, and in that silence, Jasmine's past rose like a tide, ready to flood the stage with truth. Jasmine Crockett's words hung in the studio, a quiet fire that refused to be snuffed out. The audience leaned forward, their whispers fading as her declaration, "I've been swimming in deeper waters than you'll ever know," echoed in their minds. JD Vance's face twisted, his lips parting as if to spit another barb, but for a moment he was speechless, caught off guard by her unshakable resolve. Jasmine's past, a tapestry of grit and survival, was about to spill into the present, a reminder that she wasn't just a congresswoman, but a woman who'd clawed her way through a world that tried to bury her. She didn't come from polished halls or inherited wealth. North Houston raised her, a place of cracked sidewalks and stubborn hope, where her mother, Loretta, worked double shifts at a nursing home, her hands rough from cleaning bedpans, her heart heavy from bills that never stopped coming. Jasmine was 9 when she first saw her mother cry, not from sadness but from exhaustion, counting coins for a prescription that cost more than a week's groceries. That image burned into her, a promise to fight for those who couldn't. She carried it through high school, where teachers praised her mind but warned her to speak less boldly, through law school, where classmates sneered at her second-hand blazers, and into courtrooms, where she defended people the system had already condemned. Back in the studio, Vance found his voice, his tone jagged with rage. "You're making this personal," he barked, slamming his hand on the table, the sound sharp enough to make the host flinch. "This isn't about your sob story, it's about facts, and you don't have them." His words were a lash, meant to cut deep, to paint her as emotional, irrational, less. He leaned closer, his eyes narrow, and added, "You're just loud, not smart." The insult was a blade, aimed at her core, but Jasmine's face didn't waver. She'd heard it before, from prosecutors who underestimated her, from opponents who thought her passion was a weakness. She tilted her head, her voice calm but laced with steel. "Loud?" she said. "I'm speaking for people who've been silenced, people you'd walk past without a glance. Smart? I've outworked every room you've ever been in, and I've done it with doors slamming in my face." The audience erupted, their cheers a wave crashing over Vance's scowl. He tried to interrupt, his voice rising to a shout, but Jasmine raised a hand, not in surrender, but in command. "Let me finish," she said, and the room obeyed. Even Vance, his mouth snapping shut, his frustration boiling over in his clenched fists. Her words turned to the heart of the fight. "Healthcare isn't numbers on a page," she said. "It's my neighbor. Miss Clara, who died because she couldn't afford insulin. It's my cousin who lost his job and his coverage in the same week. You call me loud, but I'm the voice they don't get to have." Each name she spoke was a brick, building a wall of truth Vance couldn't tear down. The cultural weight of her words landed, not just in the studio, but in homes across the country, where people nodded, their own struggles reflected in her. "Fight!" Vance's face reddened, his control slipping. He stood, his chair scraping the floor, and pointed at her, his voice a snarl. "You're a showboat," he said. "This isn't a courtroom, and you're not a hero. Go back to your people and leave." Policy to us, the U.S. was a line in the sand, a declaration of who belonged and who didn't. Jasmine's eyes narrowed, her breath steady, and in that moment, she knew this wasn't just about her. It was about every person told they didn't belong. She was ready to tear that line apart. "Are you ready for me to write Section 4, approximately 4,000 characters? Or do you have any feedback or additional instructions before I continue?" Section 4 will focus on Jasmine's response as she dismantles Vance's attack, amplifying the cultural resonance and her leadership, with the confrontation reaching its peak as Vance's aggression backfires. Jasmine Crockett stood at the edge of JD Vance's venom, his words, "Go back to your people," still ringing in the studio. The air crackled with his hostility, his pointed finger trembling with rage, as if he could banish her from the room, from the conversation, from the world he claimed as his. But Jasmine was no stranger to being pushed out, and she wasn't moving. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, met his, and in that gaze was the weight of every door she'd forced open, every fight she'd won. The audience held its breath, sensing the tide turning, waiting for her to strike back. She rose from her chair, not in anger, but with the quiet power of someone who knew the ground beneath her was solid. "You say go back," she said, her voice a low hum, like the warning before a storm. "But I'm exactly where I belong, speaking for people you've never cared to know." Vance's face twisted, his mouth opening to interrupt, but she pressed on, her words gaining force. "You call me a showboat, but I'm not here for applause. I'm here for the woman who skips her own medicine to buy her child's. I'm here for the man who works 2 jobs and still can't see a doctor. That's my people, and they're America, not your punching bag." The room roared, the audience's cheers a thunderclap that drowned out Vance's sputtered retort. He slammed his fist on the table, his voice a raw shout. "You're grandstanding," he bellowed, his face flushed with fury. "This isn't about your feelings, it's about results, and you've got none." The insult was desperate, a flailing attempt to regain control, but it only exposed his weakness. The host, pale and sweating, tried to steer back to health care, but the moment belonged to Jasmine, her presence commanding every eye, every ear. She stepped closer to the table's edge, her hands steady, her voice now a blade, precise and cutting. "Results?" she said. "I've seen results. Families bankrupted by one hospital bill. Communities begging for clinics you'd never fund. You talk about results, but you mean profit, not people." The cultural weight of her words landed like a stone, rippling through the studio and beyond, into homes where people clenched their fists, nodding at their screens. This wasn't just about policy. It was about who got to be seen, who got to be heard. Vance's aggression crumbled under her clarity. He stood, his chair tipping back, and jabbed a finger at her again, his voice hoarse. "You don't get it," he snarled. "You're too emotional, too caught up in your little stories to lead." The word emotional was a trap, meant to paint her as weak. But Jasmine turned it against him. "Emotional?" she said, her eyes blazing. "I'm human, something you forgot how to be. Leadership isn't ignoring pain, it's facing it, and I've faced more than you'll ever understand." The audience erupted again, some standing, their applause a wave that shook Vance's confidence to its core. He sank back into his chair, his hands shaking, his face a mask of barely contained rage. The other panelists, silent until now, nodded, faintly, their eyes on Jasmine, their respect unspoken but clear. The host stammered, trying to wrap the segment, but no one was listening. Jasmine's words had rewritten the room, claiming space for every person told they were too much, too loud, too real. As the cameras panned, catching Vance's scowl and Jasmine's steady gaze, the nation saw it. A woman who didn't just fight back, but redefined what power looked like. And the fallout was just beginning. The studio fell silent as the segment ended. Jasmine Crockett's words still echoing, a beacon for those who'd been dismissed, ignored, deemed unworthy. JD Vance sat slumped, his face a storm of defeat, his hands gripping the table's edge, as if to anchor himself against the tide of her truth. The audience's applause lingered, not just a sound, but a pulse, carrying Jasmine's message beyond the room, into homes, workplaces, and hearts across the nation. She stood, her navy blazer crisp, her gaze unwavering, and walked off the set, not with swagger, but with the quiet dignity of someone who'd claimed her place. Backstage, the crew avoided Vance's eyes. He stormed out, barking at an assistant, his voice brittle with frustration, but the damage was done. His insult, his arrogance, had unraveled him. By evening, the clip of Jasmine's response was everywhere, replayed on news channels, quoted in diners, whispered in church pews. People saw a woman who didn't just withstand a bully, but turned his weapon against him, exposing his contempt for those he claimed to represent. Vance's team scrambled, issuing a weak statement about heated debates, but it was like tossing sand against a wave. The nation had seen his truth, and it wasn't kind. Jasmine returned to her hotel, her phone, buzzing with messages, but she didn't read them. She sat by the window, watching the city's lights flicker, and thought of her mother, Loretta, who'd taught her to stand tall, even when the world pushed back. She thought of the people watching, the ones who'd felt the sting of being called, less who saw themselves in her fight. This wasn't about one debate, one insult. It was about rewriting who got to lead, who got to speak. She pulled out a worn notebook, a habit from her law days, and wrote, not for a speech, but for herself, "We don't shrink, we rise." The fallout hit Vance hard. Within days, a community center in Ohio, his home state, canceled his planned talk, citing his divisive language. A veterans group withdrew their endorsement, their letter blunt, "We need leaders who unite, not degrade." Constituents wrote to newspapers, their words raw. One retiree's op-ed reading, "I trusted him to speak for us, but he spoke against us, against people like Congresswoman Crockett, who fight for the forgotten." His office grew quiet, his appearances scarce, his voice muted by the shadow of his own words. He'd tried to diminish Jasmine, but instead he diminished himself. Jasmine didn't gloat. She returned to North Houston, not for cameras, but for a small gathering at a local library, where women, young and old, waited in folding chairs, their faces eager, some tearful. She spoke plainly. No microphone, just her voice. "You don't need permission to be heard," she said. "You don't need to change who you are to matter." A girl, no older than 12, approached after, clutching a drawing of Jasmine at the debate table. Her pen labeled courage. "My mama says you showed her how to be strong," she whispered. Jasmine hugged her, her heart full, knowing this was the real victory. Years later, that moment lived on, not as a headline, but as a turning point. Teachers played the clip in classrooms, workers quoted it in break rooms, mothers shared it with daughters, saying, "That's how you stand." Jasmine's leadership, rooted in her roots, her resolve, reshaped what power meant, not loud, not cruel, but steady, human, true. Vance faded, his name a cautionary tale, while Jasmine's rose, a symbol of what happens when you refuse to be small. And for those who watched from coast to coast, her voice became theirs, a reminder that real strength doesn't shout, it speaks, and when it does, it changes everything. If you believe one voice can shift the world, subscribe, because stories like this show us how.